It's time for some smart talk about EPCOT. Aaron Wallace is here, and you're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Hey there, it's your host Dan Heaton here on the Tomorrow Society podcast, and next month is going to be the D23 Expo in Anaheim, and one of the big questions among fans of the Disney parks is, will they make any announcements about the future of EPCOT? There are areas of EPCOT that can definitely use some help. And we've heard so many rumors about Guardians of the Galaxy. We've heard rumors about Tron, Ratatouille, so many different things they could be doing with EPCOT, especially at Future World. And I'm thinking we're going to hear at least something about what's coming. But the big question is, what will Disney do? And if they decide to move even more IP into the park, which I expect, will it fit with the overall goals and spirit of the park? My guest here today is somebody who thinks about EPCOT in that way. It's Aaron Wallace, who recently published his book, The Thinking Fan's Guide to Walt Disney World EPCOT. It's the second book in that series, and he's also been doing a podcast for a really long time called the Zip-A-Dee-Doo-Pod. So Aaron is definitely a big-time Disney fan and especially interested in what happens with EPCOT. So during this conversation, we really dive into some of the big issues on what is currently happening at EPCOT and what Disney is going to do there and what we think they should do. Now, there's definitely a spread between what many diehard EPCOT Center fans think and what Disney will likely do. I think this discussion hits on kind of a pragmatic approach. We want to see something great, but we're not expecting something outlandish. Disney isn't going to bring Horizons back tomorrow. I would love it to happen, I tell you, but they're not going to do it. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. It was really fun to record. Aaron knows a lot about the theme parks, so I can't recommend his books enough. Let's get to it. Here's my conversation with Aaron Wallace. All right. Well, I am here with Aaron Wallace, who's the host of the Zip-A-Dee-Doo-Pod podcast. He's also written The Thinking Fan's Guide to Walt Disney World Magic Kingdom, and he's recently published the next book in that series, which is all about EPCOT. Aaron, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you.
Well, great. Yeah, I wanted to have you on because a lot of times, I spend a lot of my time on this podcast talking about EPCOT and Disney World in general. And your book was about as much down the strike zone for me as possible. So it was an easy thing because I enjoyed the book so much and wanted to talk more about it.
Well, the name, like Tomorrow Society, that just gives me goosebumps. I love the whole idea, the whole concept. So, EPCOT fans are all sort of drawn toward that kind of concept, I think. Yeah,
there's a lot of us. We're all a little crazy, but but I'm sure you've heard from a few of us. But before we dive into the book too far, I'm curious to find out, how you got that much into Disney. I mean, you've done a podcast, you're doing books. Where did that start? When did you get into the parks?
Oh, gosh. I mean, it's literally been a lifelong thing. Growing up, our family went to Walt Disney World every year or two, as a lot of families do. But for me, I mean, even though the parks were always a part of my life, my first love really was the Disney movies, the Disney music. And I was just completely obsessed at the Disney books, like the book adaptations of the movies. And so that was my whole fascination. That was my groove throughout childhood. And then when I got a little older into my teenage years and started going to Disney World on my own, that's when I really fell in love with those, with the love that I have now, which is, sort of looking at it with a grown-up mind, as opposed to just like, hey, I'm a kid and I'm running around and I'm having fun. But when you grow up a little and you start to realize just how incredible these places are.
Well, yeah, and that's an interesting, because a lot of people go as kids, but there's a smaller group of people that then transition it a bit and look at it not just as, some people are like myself, or parents with kids, but others that as an adult find kind of their own way into it. So I know you live in the Orlando area now. Where did you grow up near there, or has this more been a recent thing you've chosen to do as an adult?
Yes, I've been in Orlando for, I think, 5 years now, something like that. And prior to that, I'd spent my whole life in North Carolina, born, raised, school, job, that whole thing, until I came to Florida.
Great. So, yeah, it wasn't that far of a drive. So you probably, especially like you said, you started, not a ton of people are able to, like I live in Missouri. As a teenager, I would have had a harder time just going to Disney World by myself. So I'm sure that was a benefit in helping you out there. It
was a 10-hour drive I came to know very well. I was fortunate in college, and this is probably when my Disney fandom really, really took off. It's during my college years. And I was fortunate that my group of good friends who weren't like Disney friends, they were just my friends, they also fell in love with the Disney parks along with me. So a bunch of us got annual passes as college students in North Carolina. And I'm not kidding you, there would be Friday afternoons where we were like, hey, we can get out of class early today. Do you want to get in the car and drive down to Disney World tonight? And we would just do the 10-hour road trip thing, which is the beauty of being, 20 years old. But yeah, it was a glorious time, and the drive didn't seem bad at all back then.
Well, I'm curious too, like when time of like when that was, because I know in the 2000s, especially after 9/11, that kind of period, the parks were much emptier and had really huge off seasons where you could go and like just go for a weekend and it wouldn't be a lot of people there. Is that around the time when you were going a lot? Was that era?
Yes, I think I started going on my own in 2003, and then have just continued ever since then. But and by on my own, I mean, as an adult without my parents. And this was the first big trips I took were back during Disney's Magical Gatherings promotion. I don't know if you remember that, but they actually had this software, this very like early 2000s software program that would be completely obsolete and useless today, but it was just very fun to use. We we would plan 8-10 person vacations, and everyone would interact through this software interface that Disney had created specifically for that purpose. So I always remember that particular promotion as kind of like the birth of my adult Disney going years.
Well, that's interesting too, because you're writing books, now about Epcot and the Magic Kingdom and such. And I can tell from the Epcot book that you're talking a lot about the history of the attractions and such. But is this a case where, you got into it more later? Did you get to experience a lot of the old attractions as a kid, or are those things you're learning about more now as someone interested in history?
Yeah, I did. So when I say that I got into it older, I think just the Disney parks clicked for me in a different way, once I was an adult. But yeah, I was fortunate to be in EPCOT Center when it was still EPCOT Center.
Right.
And I'm fortunate to have very vivid memories of that, because a lot of people don't. A lot of people have fallen in love with EPCOT Center despite never having been able to visit it. And so, there are definitely attractions there that I never got to do, or at least I can't remember doing. One of those is the original Journey into Imagination. It was there, but for some reason, that's something that my parents, I guess maybe they didn't want to ride it. I don't know. We never did it. And so, I look back at that sort of thing now and think, oh, what I wouldn't give to have known what I know now and to go back and to tell my parents, like, no, we are going on that ride. But as is the case with almost anyone who visited EPCOT Center in the 80s or very early 90s, it made such an impression. And those memories are just are indelible.
Yeah, for sure. You're talking to, I went as a kid in the mid 80s, but into the 90s, because I'm talking mid 80s when I was like really little. But I remember going and, just being blown away by it. And it was as much a highlight as anything. And now, not that it's terrible now, but I think there's definitely an odd split among people that went at that time, or even when you said you went, or that people that had never been until like 2000 something, where they don't know what it was like. It's not that it's, that's terrible now or something. It's just having a very different look at what things were. It seems like we're talking about something that happened 60 years ago or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's so understandable. You hear a lot of these Disney parks fans who didn't discover the Disney parks until, the 21st century. And I often hear them sort of mystified about what is everyone's hang up with Epcot of 1980s. And you can understand that if you only ever knew Epcot as it exists now, it's a pretty cool place, right? I mean,
right.
It's very easy to fall in love with current Epcot, even where it is sometimes a mixed bag. But it's when you do sort of start to learn about, well, what was in Epcot and what was the vision for EPCOT Center, that it gets a little harder to embrace every single corner of the park.
Right, because somebody now might look at it and go, wait, there was no test track, there was no Soarin', there was, what was there? What was in their place? And you tell them, oh, well, test track, there was this slow-moving 20-minute ride, and everybody looks like, what? So it's a harder sell, and it's not that I'm saying that, I love test track and Soarin', so it's not that I'm saying that they're bad, and I think that's what I liked about the book, is that you recognize that, but it's just a different place. Now it has some of the old stuff and some of the new stuff, and I think that's where it gets a little tricky because it's thematically kind of all over the map.
Right. And that really is the problem. I mean, you mentioned there are the two kinds of fans, and there are also the two kinds of Epcot that both still kind of exist. I mean, there are all these vestiges of EPCOT Center that are still there, some in the form of attractions, some in the form of just a color scheme that hasn't been updated. Sometimes it might be a logo that you find on a trash can somewhere. But there are these vestiges of EPCOT Center. And for anyone who's a fan of that, that's magical in itself. And yet there's also the 90s era Epcot, like in 94 to 96, there was sort of the second era of Epcot came in, particularly in Future World, and there are vestiges of that. And now I think we're beginning to see the emergence of a third era of Epcot. We just don't know exactly what that is yet. I have a feeling we might get a little bit of a hint come D23 Expo this summer.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that because it's coming up. It's in July, and I think the anticipation is kind of like before they announced Star Wars Land, where everyone's, well, not everyone maybe, but a lot of the Epcot fans looking at it going, well, what are they going to do? We've heard so much about Guardians of the Galaxy, or if that doesn't happen, maybe Tron or Ratatouille. The tricky part is I have this weird feeling. I know they're going to announce something, but I wonder... I know things are coming 4 or 5 years down the road, but how far we're going to go? I mean, what do you think is going to happen if you had to get out a crystal ball and predict? What are they going to announce
at D23 Expo?
Yeah,
I could see it going one of three ways. The first is that they might not mention anything about Epcot at all. It is the 35th anniversary, so it seems like an opportune time, but I also think we're almost too late into the year for them to be planning anything major for the 35th anniversary. Right. So it might just be that they're focused on Star Wars Land and whatever else they're going to talk about. Another possibility, I think, is that they give us a hint of just the general direction of Epcot, sort of a vision or a mission statement for the next era of Epcot without getting so much into any of the details. But then there is this one specific thing that's kind of floating around the rumor mill. I don't know if you saw, but some, I don't know, the word escapes me, but some plans were submitted to, I think, a local county office or something like that for an improvement to happen in the area of Universe of Energy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it looks like something very clearly is happening there. Now, whether it's something major or something minor, we don't know. I've heard through the grapevine, sort of unofficially, that it's more on the major end of the spectrum. But take that with a grain of salt. But so if we learn something specific, I think maybe it could be that, because clearly something is in motion over there.
Yeah, it could be one of those weird cases like when they had they were building Bay Lake Tower over there, and it was like all the way starting to build and they still hadn't announced anything, and people are like, something's happening there. Are they going to do something? But yeah, I have a feeling that's, if we hear anything, that's where it's going to be likely. Yeah. Now, the question, like you mentioned, is it going to be, we've got big plans for Future World, stay tuned? I think they'll probably be a little more concrete, but I'm curious because it's a really divisive issue. I mean, if they do a great job, people will eventually come around. But if they come out and they say, okay, Universe of Energy is being replaced, we're closing it next month, in 2 years, we'll have Guardians of the Galaxy roller coaster, the responses are going to be all over the map because the camps of people are so different for Epcot. And I think it could be ugly.
Yeah, well, and I fear that those of us who want something akin to Epcot Center are on the losing side of this battle. Particularly if I just listened to an interview with Bob Iger, and he wasn't talking about Epcot at all, but it was on a podcast called The Hive, and he was just doing sort of a career retrospective and talking about his philosophy for corporate leadership and multimedia conglomerates and that sort of thing. And he was really just crystallizing what we already know about Iger, which is that he is super franchise focused. There's apparently some sort of unofficial edict out there that every single Disney theme park needs to have at least one IP centric land. How that would translate to Epcot, I don't know, but if Epcot's going to go one of two ways, and it's either back toward the direction of Epcot Center or toward an IP driven third iteration, I want to be an optimist and say that they would go back toward Epcot Center. But everything I know about Iger and about the general public and what they really want tells me that we're probably heading in the IP direction instead. And yet Disney knows that they have to pay lip service to the Epcot fans. So whatever they do, they will at least spin it as honoring the original vision of Epcot. That much I'm sure of.
Yeah, the optimist in me thinks, oh, it's amazing. They could think of what they could do. The realist in me says that you're right. Because Iger's brilliant in terms of he's done, like the purchases he made for Marvel and Star Wars have turned out to be bargains, basically. I mean, what he's done for the company in that sense has been amazing. But theme parks are not his focus. Theme parks to him are another way in order to, like, synergy or whatever you want to call it, to sell the brand. And that can lead to good things. I mean, I have yet to be to Pandora so far, which I know probably isn't as strong of a brand, but I've heard they did a really good job with it. So it could be something on that level. For me, I think if they want, like you bring up a good point. They do like when Chapek talked last year, and he talked about, he had this weird thing. You mentioned at the very end of the book where he's talking about, we have a major transformation that's Disney, family friendly, and adheres to the vision, which seems kind of contradictory. To me, something like Tron, not that I, would love it to be in Epcot, but to me, I think they could sell that more with the future. The problem is it seems it's a lot like Test Track over there, but that I think they could sell easier than Guardians, but they may just be trying to push one of their biggest franchises as far as it can go.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And and one of the things I actually write about in the book is this ongoing debate over what is the proper role of intellectual properties in Epcot. The book comes to a few different conclusions given, depending on the application of the debate. But overall, I do not personally have a problem with IP. To me, it's more about what is the vision of the attraction? Like, what is the theme? What is its message? How does it connect to the futurism, the optimism, the aspiration to change the world that defined Epcot Center and that really connected with us and that still, I think, makes that park what it is at its core? If a Guardians of the Galaxy attraction can like meaningfully and credibly connect with that, then I'm all for it. I don't know that it can, but prove me wrong, Imagineering. I'm all for it. But if it's just a plug and play, like, hey, we have this fun ride and we want to put it somewhere, let's put it in Epcot, then that's the sort of thing that makes sense in the short term, but you really start to lose your brand integrity. And, Iger criticized his predecessor, Michael Eisner, for making a brand withdrawal. These were Iger's words. He criticized the original California Adventure Park as a, quote, brand withdrawal, because he essentially said Eisner went in with a short-term approach of just trying to entertain people, and he didn't give it the money it needed, and he didn't give it the creative thought and the respect for theme that it needed. And I hope that those words come back to Iger as they move forward with Epcot.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, because we have seen that lately Disney does seem to be, like with Cars Land, and, regardless, I'm not a huge fan of the Cars franchise, but they spent some serious money there and really tried to put the theming in there. And with Pandora, and I'm sure with Star Wars coming up, they have that stretch where, and it was at the end of Eisner's term, but it carried over for a long time, where it seemed like things were like, they're putting in a Toy Story playland in an overseas park, or they're, the Bugs Land, or, things that seem to be done. But they're cool areas at times, but a little more off the shelf, a little less unique, a little cheaper. And that would be, like you said, would be unfortunate. I think if they put Guardians in, they will spend a ton of money. But like you said, it's not as much about it being IP. It's harder for me to envision, even after them seeming to have created a cool attraction in California, envision how that could work with EPCOT. And I guess it's the idea, is EPCOT just part of the Disney Parks umbrella, or does it have its own identity? And that's where I trust them to give it its own identity. But I don't mean to be too negative, because I do want to talk about, I could just go off on this topic for like 3 hours, but I want to talk more about what you go into your book, because you mentioned about the IP idea and talking about Frozen Ever After. You bring up something that I think is really interesting about the predominant thrust test, which is a phrase I had not heard in a book about Disney before. Coming from, I believe you're a lawyer, or you've studied law, coming from contract law. Could you talk a bit about, like, for people who don't know, I haven't read the book yet, what does that mean and how that might apply to World Showcase?
Yeah, so it's a little thorny to try to just launch into and explain, but just not to bore everyone to death with contract law, but there is this principle in contract law called the predominant thrust test, where if a contract pertains to multiple types of agreements, so the same document might contemplate a sale of goods and also a contract for services. The courts will have to decide, well, which kind of contract is this? Because two different bodies of law, like there's a body of law for that governs services and another one that governs the sale of goods. And so the courts have to decide which one predominates the contract. And so that's this terminology came forward, the predominant thrust test. And this is where you look at it as a whole, you weigh every clause in the contract and you say, okay, which of these two thrusts seems to predominate? And so it occurred to me that this was a helpful way to think about the question of when, if ever, are characters appropriate in EPCOT and specifically in World Showcase? And what is it about characters in World Showcase that seems to bother so many EPCOT fans? And the best case study for this debate is, of course, as you mentioned, Frozen Ever After, because it replaced a classic EPCOT attraction, and it's just been this enormous controversy. And so the sort of argument that I make in the book, I guess, is that we are bothered by the arrival of IP or Disney characters in a World Showcase pavilion if those characters change the predominant thrust of the pavilion in the same way that a contract clause might change the predominant thrust of a contract. And I hope that I lay all this out much more clearly in the book than I am speaking extemporaneously now. But I think it's a very helpful way when you piece it out on paper to tackle this difficult issue, because I actually illustrate in the book how hard it is for fans to put their finger on why they don't like, for example, Frozen Ever After. And I actually walk through most of the most commonly proffered reasons, like the most common objections that people give. And they all kind of fall apart upon scrutiny. And I think it's just because it's one thing to instinctively feel like this isn't right, this goes against what I know EPCOT Center to be. But it's hard to sort of put your finger on, well, what is it that I know EPCOT Center to be? And so actually, in a weird way, the arrival of Anna and Elsa in the Norway pavilion kind of illuminated so much about EPCOT and what it is and what it could be.
Right, and that's a really good point, because we actually were there a few months ago, and the attraction was broken, so we couldn't go on it. But the pavilion itself, that pavilion is the Norway pavilion, but it's dominated when you have the Royal Summer House, which is well themed, and then Frozen Ever After. The pavilion is really dominated by Frozen. It's the Norway pavilion, but it's not. And to me, I think a good comparison you bring up is with Mexico. I don't love the Grand Fiesta Tour, but I don't feel like the Grand Fiesta Tour with the characters is like the predominant thrust of that pavilion. The pavilion still functions mostly in the same way it did before. So would you say, though, that that's different than Frozen? Because I think that's the idea, is that the thrust of that is still go inside this Mexico, go inside this night shopping area. There's a restaurant, there's water. Oh, and there's this little ride. Whereas in Frozen, I feel like Norway is really not the same place. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is, no pun intended, but a night and day difference between those two pavilions as they exist now. To sort of prove that point in the book, I create this hypothetical about Elena of Avalor, which is this new Disney Junior character, and I suppose different ways that she might hypothetically be integrated into the Mexico Pavilion, and which of those ways would cause a problem and which wouldn't. But yeah, it really does again come down to this question of the predominant thrust. And what excites me about this theory, this test, is it's really a way to unite EPCOT fans of all stripes, because there's kind of this divide between the people who hate any and all characters being there, and then people who say like, hey, but I love Disney characters and I love the Grand Fiesta Tour. and I think if we all have a set of tools to think through these issues, then actually we're all kind of on the same page here. It's just a matter of kind of clarifying it.
No, that's good. And it's interesting too to think ahead, because everything I've heard is that eventually, it's not official, so this is all rumors, Ratatouille, the ride in Disneyland Paris, will likely come to the France Pavilion. Now, what I've heard is it may not replace, I was scared at first because I love Impressions to France, which I know you also do from the book, that there's a plot next to it, so it's possible you could still have most of what's in the French Pavilion right now, Impressions to France, the ice cream shop, the deli, everything that's set up there, and Ratatouille. Now, that still does change the pavilion, but under your test, I feel like that still might be okay, assuming they don't also put all these things from Ratatouille in every other part of the pavilion.
Right. And a lot of it, I think, will come down to the specifics of, what does that attraction look like once it's built in Epcot, and where is it, and how much real estate does it take up? And, what we saw happen in Norway is not only did they just build a Frozen ride, but even the cast members in the Norwegian cast members are now taking part in the Arendellian narrative. And so if that sort of thing were to happen, like if the French cast members became employees of Gusteau's within the world of that pavilion, then those sorts of things would be problematic. So it's hard to say how far they would take it. But yeah, just to me, just hypothetically, the idea of a Ratatouille ride being built in France does not necessarily change the predominant thrust. And look, my favorite part about Ratatouille is, it made me want to go to Paris all the more. It has some beautiful Parisian vistas, and that's worthwhile. And I don't think that as Disney fans that we should shy away from the idea that Disney movies can teach people about the world or inspire them to want to know the world as well as an attraction can.
Right, and that one doesn't really bother me too much. Which I say this, I feel like, a little weird saying it, because especially now that they've gotten to the point where we've got Nemo at the seas, which I could go on a rant about that. We've got the characters in Mexico. We've got Anna and Elsa. Probably more is coming. I think it's all about the execution, and that can apply to Future World too, where, Universe of Energy needs to have some sort of change. But if the execution is good, regardless of where they go, that can change it a lot.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you also about Impressions of France, but more about the thing you bring up with that, where you talk about, the idea that some people find it boring, and more as you describe it in a way where to take a larger question of, is it okay if a theme park attraction is boring, or, what does boring mean to people? And that's the thing that all comes up with Epcot a lot, is that, the older rides were really boring. Now, I don't know. It's a tricky question. I'm just curious. What do you think about that idea? From the ones you went on, and if all of a sudden they dropped, I'm trying to think of a good example, World of Motion into Epcot or Horizons, and would a lot of people now find it boring? I mean, are we kind of living with this nostalgia because I'm thinking about things that I saw as a kid?
I honestly believe that Horizon, like boring wouldn't be the word for Horizons or World of Motion or the original Journey into Imagination. I think dated would be a fair word today. And so, I mean, yeah, if they reopened Horizons as it existed when it closed in 2017, it would be underwhelming. I think even for Horizon's biggest fans, it would be a little underwhelming outside of the nostalgia, because you would want them to spruce things up a little. And no one ever minded. No EPCOT Center fan ever minded Disney updating things. It was just the way that they updated them that, things just didn't work out, I think, as anyone planned. Not even probably the executives wanted them to, they didn't want the new Journey into Imagination to flop, but it did.
Yeah. So I know, I get what you're saying, and I agree, because I mean, Horizons, I would say, is, if not my favorite all-time attraction, but again, I'm sure at first, and I know this is not coming back, I'm not making the case that it would actually be coming back, but I would probably be amazed. But, that's the thing that I think that bug people, is when it was just destroyed. And I know there's various reasons. Maybe there was a sinkhole. There's a lot of different theories. And then Mission Space came in with much more impressive technology, but there was just something missing. And I think there's that little extra something that I'm hoping they can find with whatever they do in Future World.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should clarify, when I say that if Horizons were to reopen, it would be underwhelming, I really do just mean because it would be dated. But I think Horizons was a masterpiece. It just set at the heart of EPCOT Center, and it made such an emotional appeal. It was so inspiring. And as you say, when Mission Space came around, I mean, it was newer and it had more impressive technology, certainly, but it didn't light that emotional spark. And that's what it's all about. That's more important than anything. And so one of the things I say in the book is, we don't need EPCOT Center to build Horizons again. We just need EPCOT to inspire us to look toward our horizons again. And that's really, the missions should be as simple as that for EPCOT going forward.
Yeah, and I totally agree. If there's some way to capture some of the spirit of that, but in something that's modern and still not going to be a flop, it would be great. So, real quick, I'm curious, just in terms of Future World, if someone came to you and said, you can pick one attraction, we're going to update it. You don't have to tell me exactly what would happen, but because there's different theories on there's a few obvious candidates. What would you choose? I'm just curious, which pavilion to you right now stands out as the one that we have to do something about that right now?
Oh, this is such a good question and such a hard one, because so many of the pavilions need something. I mean, Mission Space is my least favorite pavilion. So I guess if I were to answer it in terms of least favorite, Mission Space, it does nothing for me. I can't connect with Mission Space. And I get the sense that is the case with a lot of park goers, that Mission Space kind of falls flat. So maybe that one. Yeah. But then, Journey into Imagination is probably there's probably the biggest gulf between what it was and what it is.
Right.
There than in any of the other pavilions. So maybe I would say that one. I don't know. What's your pick?
Yeah, it's tough for me, because even though I think Mission Space is fixable if they just make it a little more fun, and they mix up they customize the trip, and it's not the same thing, and it's way too serious. So I agree with that. My pick, that's a tough one. I would like them to fix Journey to Imagination, because, and I could pick Energy, but there's ways they can fix that too, and Wonders of Life reopening. But the thing about Imagination, and you mentioned it, it's not only the gulf, it's not just the fact that it's a different ride or that Figment's a little more annoying. It's like, it used to be like 15 minutes, and it had the upstairs image works, and it was this 15-minute ride with Dreamfinder and Figment and the whole pavilion, and it had the good, especially, a little bit with Magic Journeys, but then Captain EO and Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, especially, everything kind of fit together pretty well, and there was a lot to do there. And now you've got the upstairs DVC lounge. The ride's like 6 minutes. You don't have Dreamfinder. A lot of the stuff in the What If labs don't work, and they're showing short films and so to me, I look at that and I just go, like, Universe of Energy is dated, but I look at Journey to Imagination and I go, it's missing on like 5 different levels. My kids love it, so maybe I'm wrong, but that to me is the biggest thing. But it would also take probably more work than some of the other ones. So I don't know.
Yeah, it absolutely would. I mean, I think what excites me about EPCOT Center more than anything else is how bold, how brave that park was. And I always say with Disney parks, I'm made proud by their bravery when they show it. And this is kind of a weird example, but at Christmas on Main Street in Magic Kingdom, they have those Mickey's Christmas Carol dioramas, and it ends with Donald or Scrooge dangling over hell. And it's just such a bold, provocative image. And it's like the last thing anyone would expect in Magic Kingdom. And it has literary origins to justify it and everything. But I'm so proud every time I see it, because they so easily could have not gone there, but they did. And so that is EPCOT Center to me in a nutshell. I mean, you take something like Journey into Imagination, that attraction, it's a theme park ride, and it sought to explicate the imagination. That is the hardest part of the human existence to understand, right? Like, scientists don't even really understand what the imagination is. There is an actual Imagination Institute today that is a group of scientists who are trying to sort of reach a definition of what the imagination is. But no, we all know that it's there, but we don't really know what it is. And then here's this theme park ride in the 80s that came along and said, we're going to try to capture it and say something about it and illustrate it. And they succeeded. Like, that's crazy. And it's so impressive and it's so exciting. And sure, that attraction reached a point where, some of its visuals weren't speaking to modern times anymore. But what I want to see is Epcot be that brave again. So yeah, like you said, fix Journey into Imagination, but it would be hard because it was a hard thing to do the first time. I don't know how they did it. I can't believe they were so successful in actually explicating the imagination for their guests, but they did. And so that's the standard I want Epcot to hold itself to again.
Now, that's a really good point, because especially from what I've read, early on, the people that made Epcot were very set, no characters, nothing. Yet they let Tony Baxter and his group do pretty much whatever they wanted at Imagination. It was like, okay, we're going to stick to our plan except for this pavilion over here. And they did other things. You had things like Kitchen Cabaret and some other. The thing that really gets me, bold is a great way to describe it, but also weird. And I mean this in the best way possible. You see some of the things they did, like I mentioned Kitchen Cabaret. They had a really weird computer review that lasted a short time. There's just so much odd stuff that I don't even remember sometimes. Like Wonders of Life, that whole pavilion is really strange, and in the best way possible. So that's the thing too. The problem is that it was more small scale then. There wasn't. Now Disney is so big. At the time, they didn't own ABC and ESPN and weren't so international. So it seems like now there's so much riding on everything they do that they can't be as weird. But that's what I really miss, and what drew me as a kid, though I didn't know it, is just how strange everything was. It was like nothing else. It wasn't like any other theme park.
Yeah, absolutely. And, weird was the calling card of the 1980s. I mean, there's a reason Weird Al Yankovic rose to fame in that decade. It was just part of the national identity at the time, which we were into weirdness in the 80s. And one of the things I call for in the book is for Epcot to embrace the 80s. And I don't mean fall back to the 80s, but I think that there are ways subtly and artfully and in a classy way to suggest the 80s and to sort of own it. And that makes a lot of sense right now, because just worldwide there's this massive nostalgia for the 80s. We see that with like Stranger Things and all these TV reboots and all of that. But it also makes sense, I think, because it's just inevitable. Epcot will never shake the 80s entirely, just like Disneyland still hasn't lost its 1950s atmosphere. Everywhere you look in Disneyland, almost 65 years later, you're still seeing the 1950s everywhere you look. And that will always be true of Epcot. And so, they did this updated color scheme in the Future World Plaza a few years ago, and it sort of reminded me of the 80s, even though it isn't the color scheme that was there in the 80s. And so things like that, I think they're small, but they could go a long way in helping Epcot grasp some of its old identity, and weirdness is absolutely a part of that.
Yeah, and that's funny. Like last time I was there, I went in these bathrooms over by Journey to Imagination that looked like they had not been painted since like 1982 or
Yeah.
something. And they were so empty and they were playing music and I was like, "Where am I? This is the strangest place I've ever been." And you still find those kind of weird corners, or there's a photo spot for like Chase Visa holders.
Yeah.
That we walked in and I was like, I just want to stand in here for about a half hour because it was so crazy. And I don't think I'd ever been. They just recently moved over there by Journey to Imagination. And I'm like, there's all kinds of stuff like this hiding out there. So it's just funny. That's a really good point. And Magic Kingdom, the 70s are still there in certain parts of Magic Kingdom. And I hadn't heard that point made before. So that's cool. I wanted to ask you kind of one more big question before we start to wrap up here. I was listening to your show that you did for your podcast about going to Shanghai Disneyland. And you had ridden the Pirates ride, and you went on this great kind of rant about if they can do that, why do we have all these things that are still not working, like the broken Yeti and like all these other elements in Florida? And I would even add to your list the TV in Spaceship Earth showing the Apollo mission that's still not working months later.
Yes.
But so why do you think that is? Basically, to summarize, why do you think in the U.S. that they seem to be a little more complacent or a little more, they're just not pushing that hard? What's the big drive in that? Because that's something I think about a lot when I go to the parks.
Well, I think it's complicated for a few reasons. First, let me just say it probably isn't entirely fair to compare the state of Magic Kingdom to the state of Shanghai Disneyland, which was just built last year.
For sure.
And so they've got that going for them. But with the Asia parks, it's not just Disney, right? So these parks are owned by organizations that consist of the government in the respective countries, as well as Disney, as well as third-party private investors. And so cash flow is just a whole different thing in those parks. And you have, like, for example, Tokyo, which I think does the best job in terms of investment and maintenance and theme design. They have the Oriental Land Company that's overseeing day-to-day operations. And so it's a whole different system over there. And you kind of wish we had a system like that here. Not that I would necessarily want Disney to partner with the government to start running its parks, but so I think that's part of it. But there is complacency also because look at the attendance numbers. Now, granted, they dipped ever so slightly, but sort of by design, right? Because this year Disney raised prices so that they could lower attendance but still make more money. So the parks are doing very well. And so, complacency is a part of it. I also have a podcast where I sort of go after this notion that Disney has to compete with Universal. Disney is not actively competing with Universal, and they don't need to right now. And Universal isn't a threat. And actually, Universal success is just a boon to Disney's own success. And so I think there's total complacency, and Epcot is where the complacency is at its worst because they have these international festivals to fall back on all year, and they do reliably bring in tons of people, and they seem to be guests' favorite things about Epcot these days. And Disney knows that, and they make tons of money off of it. So maybe it isn't all that imperative that you get Ellen's animatronic back inside Universe of Energy if no one's riding it. They're all out, buying food at a kiosk.
Yeah, and that's when I was there last. It was during the Flower Garden Festival, and that was as big of a draw as almost anything there beyond a few headliners. And it's even more, I think, during Food and Wine or on like a weekend in October where you just think like, where did all these people come from? But yeah, it's almost like Epcot in a way they have the live entertainment and everything. It's almost morphed into some sort of like, not locals park, but like festival zone. Like we have a local botanical garden here that constantly has things like the Japanese festival and drinking things and all these ways with bands. And I see a lot of similarities in what they do with Epcot, which I don't hate. I just wish that they could find a way to balance it out a little bit more. But you bring up a great point and the Universal point is good too. We could do almost a whole podcast on that. But Universal's in a growth phase. They didn't build a lot of things for a while until the first Harry Potter. And I like seeing them do great things. One, because I want there to be more things to see, but it does push Disney to do better with Pandora and better with Star Wars because they're doing it. But I would like Disney just inwardly to look at ways they can improve. And they seem to be doing that. I just wish that they pushed a little harder. But like any fan, we're always going to want that.
Yeah. And, it's a great thing that fans are invested, and, we should be. We should be invested. We should care. Like, we should really, really care what happens with EPCOT Center, because if we don't, no one will. But if we do, they might care to some extent. We might get, something less horrible than what they might have planned without outcry from fans. And look, actually, I'm releasing a new podcast episode this week about Pandora. And one of the things I talk about is that actually, I think Pandora's saving grace in part has been the fan outcry that lasted over 6 years, and especially during the first year when it was announced as, quote, Avatar Land. Fans were very upset about it, and even in the general public, and I cite some articles from the mainstream media, there was just widespread apathy about this idea of Avatar Land. And in response to that, or at least partly in response to that, we now have Pandora featuring the world of Avatar, and there's been this very pointed distancing of the land from the Avatar IP, and it's to the land's benefit, because when you first enter, it feels like you're walking into an immersive Disney environment, the thing you come to Disney theme parks for, and all of the IP is secondary and kind of buried deeper within the land. And I think that fans can really take a lot of credit for that.
Well, that's a really good point, because when I get there, I feel like I'm almost as excited, probably more excited, to just walk around and see it than I am by the rides. And for me, who's generally more of an attractions guy, like, I'm like, come on, I want to see new attractions. I don't just want to see, a new restaurant or a new shop. But when I look at that, I go, that place, especially in the Animal Kingdom, which is already a park that's cool to hang out in more than all the rides itself, I feel like it fits really well. So I'm more excited than I thought I'd be 6 months ago or a year ago.
Yeah, the funny thing is, it's almost like they knew that this would be the case. The land looks like it has been designed knowing that guests will want to just stop and take pictures and just stare at the beauty of it all. And so you have a lot of these sort of little alcoves that have been constructed like just for that purpose. And it's interesting that the land is the flagship of the land, like the land itself is.
No, that's great to see. So what's next for you? Are you going to do more books? Are you going to wait on the studios until Star Wars and Toy Story open? Or do you have any books in the works, or just taking a little break?
Well, studios for sure is probably going to be a little down the road, because it would be the world's shortest book right now. There's not very much there. As much as as excited as I am to someday hopefully write about Hollywood studios, I do have a few book projects in the works. I don't know the release order for those projects yet, or the time frame, so I probably don't want to say too much yet, but there are things in the works, including some kind of new and exciting things, and I'm just really, really sort of enthused and driven for them right now, and look forward to being able to share more about them in the future.
Awesome. Well, if people want to find out more about your podcast and this book, what's the best place to go online? Where should they go?
Oh, gosh, I feel like I have so many different things. All right, I'll try not to run out of breath. My website is aaronwallaceonline.com. There you'll find my podcast, which is called Zip-A-Dee-Doo-Pod. It's also on iTunes or wherever you find your podcast. You can also find my books, The Thinking Fan's Guide to Walt Disney World, Magic Kingdom, and Epcot, as we discussed. I also have a book on the movie Hocus Pocus for any Disney movie fans who might be listening. And you can get autographed copies on my website, or you can get those from Amazon, not autographed, or wherever books are sold. You can follow me on Twitter at Aaron Wallace, and I think that's all the important things.
Well, I'll put all those in the show notes, just in case anyone didn't catch any of those. You can click on the links right from the site. So
good deal.
Yeah, and the book was great. I hope that our conversation made people more interested to read it. They didn't think we were thinking too much, but I love the book, and hopefully looking forward to what you're doing down the road.
Thanks so much, Dan. Yeah, this was a great conversation. I get so excited about this stuff. And, I love I think when I go to your website, it says something like intelligent writing about Disney parks. And I love that Disney fans as adults can take the things that we love seriously, and we can appreciate them as entertainment, yes, but also as works of art, because that's what these theme parks are. And so I love that you're contributing to that. And I've enjoyed being on your show.
No, thanks, Aaron. It was great having you on the show. Hopefully you can come back again down the road.
I'd love to. Thanks, Dan.
Well, that was really fun. I think I could talk about Disney World and Epcot all day. And if you're somebody who also likes to talk about theme parks all day, you should check out tomorrowsociety.com, where along with information on the podcast, I also write about what's happening currently with theme parks and the past of things like EPCOT Center. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can contact me by emailing dan@tomorrowsociety.com, or you can follow me on Twitter @TomorrowSOC or Facebook @TomorrowSociety. iTunes reviews are amazing. They make me really happy. So if you could rate or review the show on iTunes, I would love it because it helps me to spread the word on the show. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you all again very soon.